I grew up in a small city in northern Thailand, not too far from here, called Chiang Mai. And this is a picture of my mother and sister in front of our home in 2005. And the house was along the river, but as you can see, sometimes during times of torrential rain, the river would overflow, causing these types of floods, which you can see from the smiles on their face. It wasn't catastrophic, but certainly these are the type of experiences I had growing up. And just last November, I was back. Chiang Mai experienced its worst flooding in recorded history. Some of you might have seen that in the news. Some of the elephant camps even got flooded. That part of the world is famous for its elephants. Some of them passed away, very sadly. And so these are kind of common experiences for this part of the world, as it is in many others. When I finished high school, I went to study engineering at MIT, and me and my family decided to go on Christmas vacation to the southeastern coast of India while I was there. And we landed on December 26, 2004. Not sure if you remember what happened on that day, but that was the day of the devastating 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which led to humongous loss of life and destructions of livelihoods and homes in many countries in the region. And luckily, the airport was a bit inland, and so we were safe, but witnessing the impact of that event on communities had a profound impact on me. So when I went back to study engineering, I decided to look at buildings and how do we make sure that they can withstand these type of extreme events, specifically from earthquakes. There weren't anybody studying earthquake engineering at MIT, but there were people looking at old buildings, and old buildings are really interesting. Like old people, they've experienced a lot of things. They've survived a lot. They've seen extremes and weathered them. So I thought perhaps these old buildings have some of the blueprints to understanding resilience. I then decided to do a master's looking at materials. I thought perhaps if we have better quality materials, our homes and infrastructure can be built to withstand these extreme events. And I studied these hybrid fiber reinforced concretes that can bend and do extraordinary things. And just as I was finishing that master's, there was another devastating event, earthquake in Haiti, which destroyed the capital city of Port-au-Prince, the largest loss of life from an earthquake in recorded history again. And I was only supposed to be there for a few weeks. I ended up staying for 2 years working on various disaster recovery and response activities with the World Bank. And what came out of that experience is really this sense that understanding risk at the building scale or at the material scale it was completely insufficient to understand how risk is created over time through very complex processes. And we needed new tools to better understand that. So I went to Stanford to do my PhD on urban risk analysis. And how do we understand these issues at scale? And while I was there, I also founded the Stanford Urban Resilience Initiative, specifically as an initiative to bring multiple disciplines together to think about these issues, because these are all of society issues, and we need all types of disciplines to address them. And I stayed involved in disaster response and recovery. Specifically, I spent a lot of time in Nepal following the earthquake. So now I'm in Singapore. I've been here now for nearly 8 years, where I lead the Disaster Analytics for Society Lab. And we look at many things. We look at many hazards. We look at floods. We look at cyclones, extreme heat, earthquakes still. We look at their impacts on the built environment, and we look at their impacts on communities. And more, we're also investigating questions around equity or inequity of risk. And so I wanted to first kind of unpack this word risk, which I've been using a lot, because in my field, we have a specific way of thinking about this term, which I think is actually very useful. Risk is the combination of three things: hazards, and hazards are the extreme events. These are the floods, the earthquakes, the tropical cyclones, and so forth. But you also need two other things to create risk. You need exposure. Exposure describes the people, the infrastructure, the roads, the communities that might be impacted by these extreme events. And then vulnerability. And vulnerability describes the propensity to suffer harm. So in this drawing, these two homes might have different levels of vulnerability because one is raised up above the ground while the other one is at floor level. So when it floods, it might get more damaged, right? But you can think about vulnerability in terms of social vulnerability in a similar way. Different communities might be differentially vulnerable to these extremes. And so one of my main questions is, how is risk changing over time? And what do we do about that? How do we make sure that we are still resilient to these events? And we need to look at these three elements. Hazards, we know, and we've heard already earlier today, that climate change is driving changes in hazards, right? Increasing heat, increasing frequency and intensity of tropical storms and other events, changing patterns of rainfall, perhaps. But I wanted to highlight the fact that if we think about this as like a classic probability distribution, and it could be representing any type of process. It could be the amount of rainfall. It could be the temperature every day. Well, most days, these processes are fine. We've adapted to them. Rainfall is great. We need rainfall. What we're really concerned about are extremes. When rainfall is so extreme that it causes flooding, like it did in my home in the picture that I showed earlier. One of the main concerns when it comes with climate change is that even small changes in this distribution, changes in the mean and variance of this distribution specifically, lead to huge changes in the number of extremes. So these are not linear. So when we talk about a 1.5 degree increase in mean temperature, that might not seem very significant. I think especially, for a lot of us living in Singapore, we're used to heat, and 1-2 degrees more, we might think that's fine, we can adapt to that. The problem is what it does to the number of extremes, the days of extreme heat and how high that extreme heat is, and likewise for rainfall and for all these other processes. Not only can we expect many, many more extremes, but unprecedented extremes, events that are bigger than anything we've ever experienced before. And because we have spent decades, centuries building our infrastructure and our cities for particular standards, that also means that they're not adapted to these type of events. So not only are the events bigger, but we're also much less prepared for them. And fundamentally, I think that's the main driver of impact of climate change, is through what it does to extremes. But that's not the only thing happening, and I think when most people think about changing risk, growing risk, they automatically and perhaps only think about climate as the main driver, but there are other drivers. Exposure. Well, global population is increasing, so more people will be exposed, naturally. Most are being absorbed in cities, and most of those in coastal cities, which are statistically just more exposed to coastal flooding, sea level rise, tropical cyclones. Just to give you a sense of the scale at which this is happening, there are more people living in cities today than there were total people on the planet in 1980. 1980 is not very long ago. It's when the second Star Wars movie came out, The Empire Strikes Back. And obviously these processes are still ongoing, right? We can expect this to continue in the future, at least for a while. So these are trends at the macro scale. But then when you look within cities themselves, what we see is that as cities get constrained in space, that puts more and more pressure for people to occupy more and more hazardous land. So people will start building on steep slopes. They will start building on floodplains. And we see this in cities everywhere in the world. I'm not talking about developing countries or low-income countries here. I'm talking about all cities. And finally, vulnerability. And I think in general, we think that we're getting smarter in the way that we build our infrastructure. Sadly, I think we have relatively little evidence of progress in that space. And one of the things that I've been thinking about quite a bit is how increasing complexity of our systems, interconnectivity of our systems, is driving new forms of vulnerability that we are currently not accounting for. So a flood in Bangkok can have an impact in San Francisco. And this is not a hypothetical example. The 2011 floods in Bangkok had impacts all over the world. If you tried to buy a laptop around that time, you probably paid double because of what this event did to the cost of electronics throughout the world, right? We are more and more a connected planet, but that does come with new forms of vulnerability. So, you know, when we think about kind of changing risk, growing risk, we do need to think about these three elements: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And unfortunately, the general trends that we're seeing is that each of these are driving changes in risk for the worse. So, you know, a lot of the risk trajectories of a lot of places that we're familiar with might look like this. So at this point, you know, in this presentation, thank you. You know, not only are we all concerned about climate change, but I also just explain how our exposure is also changing and growing, and vulnerability might also be as well. So it's all kind of pretty depressing, and we have other things as well to be concerned about. But actually, I am quite hopeful, and I wanted to share some of the reasons why I am quite hopeful. The first is just a little bit of a rant, I guess, but everyone here in this room, I think we need to remind ourselves, each other, and the people we work with, that a lot of what we're fighting for is not just to make the world less risky. We're also fighting to make it healthier, safer, more equitable. And these are very exciting things. These are things that we should really look forward to. I think so much of the narrative around climate is catastrophist and driving change from fear. And I think we've seen that that actually doesn't work very well. And at least part of the narrative needs to be about how the world that we're trying to build is one that we should look forward to and we can get excited about. And you know, as a faculty member, I work with a lot of young people who do have deep climate anxiety, who do feel paralyzed. And I think we need to help build an alternative image for them so that they can actually look forward to this future and so take action to work towards it. The second is that we are not at the mercy of climate change. Part of the reason why I think this framework is so important is that it highlights how even if hazards are scary, and even if we feel like we don't have much control over them, which is true, there's very little that a city like Manila can do to just prevent the occurrence of a cyclone. At the local scale, there's very little it can do. But they can do things about their exposure and vulnerability. So ultimately, we are active players in reducing risk, despite the fact that not everyone or every country has the same kind of power to act upon that. So I do acknowledge that, obviously. So I showed this picture as a source of concern, but actually it's also a huge source of hope and encouragement. In order to meet the needs of the growing urban population, we will have to build so much infrastructure. I remember reading an estimate that in the next 20 years, we're going to have to build as much infrastructure as in the past 6,000 years. And that's in many ways exciting, because that means that if we do so with a proper understanding of risk, with a proper understanding of how to be resilient, we can really set ourselves on a virtuous and resilient path. I really like this quote by Lao Tzu. If you don't change directions, you may end up where you're heading. A lot of the work that we've been doing in the lab is developing tools to show people where we're heading and how decisions today can change that trajectory so that we can change directions. And it's much easier, frankly, to change direction now and avoid building risk than addressing risk once it's already built. And finally, the third reason why I'm very hopeful is that we have so many of the answers already. I'm all for innovation, but there's a lot of things we don't need innovation for. there's things we already know how to do. We've known how to do it for decades, and they work. They're proven. In the context of the disaster risk reduction space, one of the big challenges that we have, when I talk about solutions, there's so many amazing things that we've been working on for many, many years. Nature-based solutions, which is one of the key discussion points for the next panel. Better early warning systems. We're using kind of new technologies to better understand risk. We have innovations in the policy space with institutions. We're thinking more and more about issues of equity, risk finance, better remote sensing technologies. None of these are new, really, and they already have demonstrated their efficacy in helping us manage risk. The problem is that in the risk management space, when we implement these solutions successfully and they work, no one knows about it. No one hears about the major flood that happens, and no buildings are impacted, and no one is impacted. Everyone knows about the flooding in Valencia. No one would have heard of a flood in Valencia had it not destroyed communities, right? Case in point, how many of you have heard about Cyclone Fani? I see one hand, very few people. Cyclone Fani was the biggest cyclone to make landfall in India in 20 years. Huge, huge event, happened in 2019. The reason no one knows about it is that almost no one died from this event. The last major cyclone to make landfall in that same area 20 years prior had caused, I think, 15,000 lives lost. This one, I think, 22, right? Because the government, the speaker, in the earlier session mentioned some of the huge progress that had been made in India in disaster risk management. They evacuated 6 million people in emergency shelters along the coast to prevent the loss of life, and that's amazing. We did the reanalysis with one of my PhD students, who I think is here. She ran this analysis where we reanalyzed the event if people had not been evacuated, and what we find is that likely somewhere along the orders of 10,000 lives were saved from that evacuation, right? But no one knows about it because they were evacuated, in fact. So we need to be better at sharing these success stories because without that, it makes it very hard to share lessons so that they can be replicated elsewhere, so that they can be adapted elsewhere, scaled in the many communities around the world that need them. In order to support that, we started a few years ago the Averted Disaster Award, specifically to highlight these types of interventions. And if you know, and I'm sure you're working on amazing works that should be nominated for such awards, so please look this up if you're interested. Some of the amazing people in my lab are here, so I encourage you to talk with them to learn more about their amazing work. And I've also had the privilege of working with a lot of great institutions that support this work. And if you want to learn more about some of the work that we do, feel free to look at this QR code. But for now, that's the main things I wanted to share with you this evening.